In the last lesson I read from Proverbs 30 that talk about 4 little things on the earth that are exceedingly wise because of what they can do. And I also mentioned how nouns are a lot like those 4 things because of all the ways that they can be used. And we gave this example sentence, Greg gave me his notebook. So there's a series of nouns in this little sentence that give us a basic overview of how the nouns can be used. Greg would be the subject of the sentence, or in Greek it would be the nominative. His is a possessive word, it's his notebook, and in Greek a word like this would be called the genitive case. Me would be the indirect object because he's giving his notebook to me, and the one way we can identify the indirect object in a sentence is by asking to whom or for whom was the action done, and he gave his notebook to me. We're often going to include the key word to with our translation of the dative case, because the dative is generally the case of the indirect object. And then in this sentence, the word notebook would be the direct object. In this case, we'll call the accusative in Greek. So we have 4 basic cases. There's another case in Greek, the vocative case, but it's used very rarely. And so our discussion of it will be very limited this year. I think we will talk about it a little bit. There's 4 basic cases in Greek, the nominative, genitive, dative, and accusative. And these are the basic ways they're used. We also mentioned in the last lesson the 24 different endings. In Chapter 6 we're introduced to the nominative and accusative case endings, and then in Chapter 7 we fill out the chart with the genitive and the dative case endings. And we need to memorize all of these if we're going to be efficient in our parsing and in our translation throughout the year. So right now is the time where we want to focus on memorizing them. And we can focus on the similarities. For instance, we can think about, well, the genitive and the dative in the singular and the masculine and neuter columns have the same endings. It's upsilon and upsilon. They're in the genitive singular row. And the dative singular row, all of them are iota. And the accusative singular, all of them are nu. And we might ask ourselves, well then, how will we be able to distinguish the words, or let's say distinguish between the gender, if they all have the same ending? And if you remember our discussion, the last couple of chapters, it will be the stem vowel, because the feminine, that middle row there, or sorry, the middle column, those are going to end in alpha or eta, their stem vowel, and then the ending will be attached. So if the stem vowel is alpha or eta, we know it's feminine. For the masculine neuter, they'll end in omicron in their stem vowel. Now they share endings, the masculine and neuter column. So how will we know the difference between those two? Well, it'll be the way we memorize the word. For instance, if we memorize the word logos, that's the lexical form, and the lexical form is always the nominative singular. So if we look at the nominative singular row, it's the masculine that ends in sigma. Well, if we memorize a word like ergon, and we see it ends with a nu, we know automatically, by virtue of the way we memorize the word, that that word is a neuter word. So those are some tips that are going to help us distinguish as we parse the words out. If we look in the plural rows, we can see the masculine and feminine, they share their ending of iota there. And in the genitive plural and dative plural, they all share the same endings. Own, is. If we go over to the neuter column, we can see that the nominative plural and accusative plural are going to share the same endings. And when the letters are underlined like that, that means that that letter swallows up the stem vowel. And so basically, we might kind of be left guessing as to what the gender of the word will be because the stem vowel won't appear. But that's okay, because as long as we remember how we memorize the word, we'll remember the gender as well. These are the 24 endings that we want to become really familiar with, and we're going to do a lot of practice with these endings and with parsing in the coming weeks. Here's what the endings look like when they're actually attached to words. Logos is the case word for, or the practice word, let's say, for the masculine column. Graphe and hora for the feminine. And then ergon for the neuter. And so we can see in the nominative singular there that logos, that ends in sigma, so we know by the way we memorize it that it's masculine, or ergon over in the neuter, that ends in nu. It's not ergos, it's ergon. So we know by virtue of the way we memorize the word that it's neuter. And then the feminine or first declension words are always going to have the stem vowel of alpha or eta. So let's take a look at some nominative words in their own context to give you an idea of how these words function. Here's a fairly common phrase, God loved the world, taken from John 3:16. Agapesen hotheos ton kosmon. So agape, that's the verbal form of it, means loved. And hotheos, okay, well if we compare that with what we know about case endings, we say, all right, well theos, that's a masculine word. Here it ends in the sigma, and so that's a sign of the nominative singular case. And it is. It's just God, and it's going to be the subject of the sentence, even though in Greek the verb comes first. In our English translation, we always put the subject first. God loved, and then we've got ton kosmon, the world. And we know the case of kosmon by looking again at the ending. That's the accusative singular ending. Again, if we think, well, doesn't the neuter singular nominative end in nu as well? Yes, it does. But we memorize kosmon, kosmos. The lexical form will generally, almost always, show us the gender of the word. So kosmos, it ends in a sigma. That's a sign of the masculine gender. So if it ends in the nu here, it's got to be the accusative singular. And so that's the direct object of the sentence. God loved who or what? God loved the world. Here's another example. And the angels stood around the throne. Hoi angeloi. Okay, angeloi is from angelos, but here it ends in a iota. And the iota, if it's not subscripted, and here it's standing at the end of the word, then that shows us that it is nominative plural. And so it would be translated angels. Sometimes we forget if we're parsing it plural, we need to include generally what is the S in English. You know, S makes a word plural generally. There's a few exceptions to that. But we always want to remember if it has the plural ending, let's make it plural in our English translation too. The angels stood around the throne. Or this one, God is spirit. Now, we're not going to recognize pneuma. Pneuma is a third declension word. It's a little complicated on how it forms. But here we see pneuma functioning as the predicate nominative. So the first two examples, God loved the world, the angel stood around the throne, those are both functioning like subjects. But God is spirit. Here, spirit is renaming God. It's giving us a characteristic of God, and this is called the predicate nominative. This is another function of the nominative case. And so it's a lot like English. Both of the subject and the predicate nominative will appear in the subjective case, the case of the subject. The same is true in Greek. Now, though we may not recognize the form of pneuma, that actually is, just like theos, that is, that's going to be nominative singular. It's third declension, so we'll talk about the formation of those later. But this would be an example of a predicate nominative and shows us it's another use of the nominative case. God is spirit. The accusative case, this is the case of the direct object. He was speaking the word to them. Okay, so ton logon. He was speaking, literally in Greek I'm going to read it, elale, he was speaking, altois, to them, ton logon, the word. Okay, so logon comes from logos. Here it has the case ending of the nu, which shows us it's the accusative or the case of the direct object. Literally, he was speaking the word to them. Altois is going to be the dative plural because it ends in the iota sigma. I think we can recognize that too. He was speaking the word to them. Or, so that they may see your good works. Don't worry about the words in these Greek sentences that you can't recognize. Just focus on the nouns for now. So that they may see your good works. Kala is an adjective which means good. And then we've got erga. Okay, so that comes from ergon. That's the way we memorized it. It ends in the nu in the lexical form, so it's a neuter word. And it ends in the alpha here. Well, if we go back to our chart, the neuter words that end in alpha, they can either be nominative plural or accusative plural. And we can see as we kind of work through this sentence, okay, that they may see your good works. It's got to be the accusative plural. And since it's plural, we'll include the S on our translation, so it won't just be work, it'll be works. So that they may see your good works. So the first example, second example, these are examples of direct objects or the accusative functioning that way. And then here's one that shows us the accusative can also be used as the object of a preposition. This is really common for the accusative case. The author in our book doesn't talk much, at least in this chapter, about the other uses, but since they're so common, I'm going to mention them in this introduction to the nouns as well. Going or go into all of the world. Okay, so eis is a preposition which is translated in or into. En ton kosmon is the world, and apanta is just an adjective which means all. But since ton kosmon is following the preposition eis, it will, a lot of times the object of the preposition for eis is going to be in the accusative case. And so it's not really telling us, oh, it's the direct object of the sentence. It's simply by virtue of being object of a preposition, it takes the accusative case. Something interesting about the cases that we'll find, specifically the accusative, dative, and genitive, is that all three of them can be objects of the preposition. And as we study prepositions, we'll find that that's really significant. When we see a preposition followed by a noun, or if that noun is the object of the preposition, in this case, into all the world, it kind of goes together as a phrase. It's a prepositional phrase. The case of the noun is going to reflect very frequently the meaning of that preposition. And here it's really not signifying anything special except for the fact is eis almost is always followed by an accusative case. Here it's just telling us, okay, kosmon is the object of the preposition. It's not functioning as the direct object of the sentence. And that's kind of intuitive as we go through it anyway. Go into all the world. But the accusative can also be used as the object of the preposition. The dative case. This would be translated, this example, if to others I am not an apostle, yet I am to you. I, right there as it starts off, I is translated if, and alois, okay, that's from alos, which means other or another. But if we look at the ending, you say, okay, that's the dative plural ending, and the key word for the dative is to. Sometimes it will be another prepositional word like with or for, depends on the context. Now, but here the key word to works really well, and we know that because of the ending. So if to others, uk emi apostolos, I am not an apostle, alage humin emi, yet I am to you. This would be an example of the indirect object, a really common use for the dative. Or this sentence would be translated, to the one who knows to do good and doesn't do it, to him it is sin. So the last part of this Greek sentence, the last phrase is hamartia auto, that's the word emboldened there, that's the dative case, estin. Hamartia auto estin. Generally for nouns, when we see the iota subscript, it's a signal that, all right, we're dealing with a dative singular. And so we'll generally want to provide some kind of keyword in the translation. So we've got hamartia auto estin. To him, it is sin. And often, like we have to do in Greek, we'll rearrange it a little bit so it makes better sense in English. The key word, to, and then this is the word auto is from autos, which means he. And so we'll just put to him. Hamartia auto estin. To him, it is sin. The dative can also be the object of a preposition, as we see here. The man was a prophet, powerful, and powerful is dunatos, and then comes en ergo, translated indeed. The man was a prophet, powerful indeed, and word before God. So en ergo is translated indeed, and what's interesting is logo is also the dative singular, and it follows, and it's kind of a caboose. It's part of this prepositional phrase, in word and indeed, even though the word, in both English and Greek, the word en or in, it doesn't have to be repeated. We understand that they go together, indeed and in word, before God. So ergo and logo both are dative singular because of the iota subscript. Here we're not going to include the keyword to because it's the object of a preposition. Something we want to remember is when these cases are functioning as the object of a preposition, that is, there's a preposition that comes right before them, we don't need to include the key word. We're going to drop it. Here's another example. Abraham believed in God. In this case, the dative is really functioning like the direct object, isn't it? Abraham believed in God. Now, might also say, well, it could be functioning like a prepositional phrase, perhaps. Probably more technically, it's the direct object, and the dative often functions that way. Certain verbs in Greek prefer to take the direct object in the dative case. So Abraham believed God, or Abraham believed in God, if we want to include that prepositional idea, which is often, again, inherent in the dative case. To theo. So it's from theos. In this case, it includes the article. Abraham believed God or in God. Either one of those translations would be good. And finally, the genitive case. Here's an example. So that the body of sin might be destroyed. Of sin is the two words translated tes hamartias. Hamartia is the word for sin. Here it has the sigma at the end. So what's interesting, if a feminine word has a sigma, it could either be genitive singular or accusative plural. And we talked about this in our last online session, that, okay, well, it has the article in this case, tes hamartias. Tes is the article, and the article, the genitive singular and accusative plural, is distinguished. So tes is the genitive singular. If it was accusative plural, it would be tos. You can't tell the difference by just looking at hamartias, but by looking at the article you can. So we know, because of the article, it's got to be genitive singular. Oftentimes the broader context will help us translate it correctly too. But in this case, we're just going to translate it of sin. We include the keyword of because it's the genitive case. We may not always do that, but lots of times the keyword of works well for our translation. To you it is given to know the mysteries of the kingdom of God. Okay, so tes basileas is translated of the kingdom, and then it's followed by tou theou. Again, that's in the genitive singular case, so it's of God, of the kingdom of God. Because the Son of Man is about to come in the glory of his Father with his holy angels. Like I mentioned earlier, the genitive case, like the dative and the accusative case, can be an object of a preposition. Meta, there in bold in the Greek, meta is a preposition which means with. And here it's followed by the genitive case. And in fact, meta, if it was with the accusative case, would mean after. But since it's with the genitive case here, it's translated with, which is interesting about prepositions when their translation depends upon the case of their object. That takes a little getting used to. Let me say it one more time. The meaning of a preposition is determined by the case of its object. So the object in this prepositional phrase is angels, and since it's the genitive, we know we need to translate meta with and not after. It would be translated after if it was followed by an object in the accusative case. So it's translated with his holy angels. Ton angelon, we're not going to provide the key word here like of the angels. We don't need to include of because it's the object of a preposition. And then the last word in this prepositional phrase is altou. That's from altos. It's also in the genitive case, but it's modifying angelon, and so it means his. His holy angels or the holy angels of him. His is just a little more concise, so we'll stick with that. The kings of the nations lord over them. Kuriousin is the word translated lord over. And what's interesting is this is a verb that prefers its direct object in the genitive case. It's true that the accusative is generally the case of the direct object, but it's also true that the dative and the genitive can also function like direct objects, depending on the verb mainly. So the kings of the nations lord over them. Since it's functioning here as a direct object, we don't need to include the keyword of. So we said that these nouns are exceedingly wise in the sense that they have a number of functions. A little word can function a lot of ways in Greek depending on its case ending. The nominative more often than not functions like the subject, but it can also function as a predicate nominative, renaming or giving an essential quality of the subject or of the noun it's going with. The genitive. generally shows possession, and generally we can include the keyword of. But the genitive can also be the object of a preposition, and sometimes it will function like the direct object. The dative generally functions like the indirect object, but it could also be the object of a preposition, and sometimes it will function like the direct object in a sentence. And then there's the accusative. More often than not, it will function like the direct object. Sometimes you're going to see it function like the object of a preposition. These we want to focus on the main uses, but we definitely need to be aware of the lesser uses for each one of these cases.